45-year-old Jamaican national Ernesto Elliott was due to be deported from Great Britain in December of 2020 when he won his challenge to stay at the last minute. His appeal to remain in the UK was backed by prominent politicians and celebrities who signed open letters opposing the deportation of Elliott and 22 other serious criminals. Their demand to halt the deportation was granted, despite Elliott's lengthy and violent criminal history dating back to 2003. 6 months later, in June of 2021, Elliott and his 22-year-old son Nico robbed and killed a man in broad daylight during a drug-related dispute in South London's Greenwich neighbourhood. Footage captured by onlookers showed the duo and a third suspect swinging long-bladed knives and a hammer at their machete-wielding opponent, 35-year-old Nathaniel Ayuego. The fight lasted for 8 minutes before Ayuego collapsed with a knife wound to the heart. He died 6 days later and the accused killers were arrested. Elliott was convicted of murder and robbery and sentenced to life, with a minimum of 26 years in prison. His British-born son Nico received a life sentence with a 22-year minimum. The case has caused outrage among politicians who supported Elliott's deportation and continued to oppose letting dangerous convicted criminals stay in Britain. Number 17. The murder of Aya Hatchem. In a tragic case of mistaken identity, 19-year-old British law student Aya Hatchem was murdered in a drive-by shooting in Lancashire, England, in May of 2020. The hit was organized by 40-year-old tire firm boss Feroz Suleiman, who meant to kill his business rival and neighbor Pachar Khan, and was carried out by 33-year-old hitman Zamir Raja. Ayaz Hussein, who recruited the gunman, had a visibly shocked look on his face in CCTV footage of the murder's immediate aftermath. The video captured the exact moment Hussein realized that they had killed the wrong person. Hatchem had nothing whatsoever to do with the crime or the business rivalry leading up to it. She had moved to the UK from Lebanon nearly a decade earlier in search of a better life and was pursuing that goal by honest and lawful means. 7 men were arrested in connection with the senseless act of violence, and they were all found guilty of murder following a 12-week trial in 2021. Feroz Suleiman, Zamir Raja, Anthony Ennis, Ayaz Hussein, Abu Bakr Sataya, Kashif Manzoor, and Uthman Sataya were all sentenced to life with varying minimum terms ranging from 27 to 34 years. Uthman Sataya's girlfriend, Judy Chapman, was acquitted of murder but found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years behind bars. Number 16. Daniel Ainsley. After becoming homeless, 24-year-old Daniel Ainsley was lucky enough to have a friend who was willing to house him. He showed his gratitude, or lack thereof rather, by behaving violently, prompting 48-year-old father of 2, Mark Woolsey, to kick him out of the accommodation. Angered over the decision, Ainsley stabbed Woolsey to death at the victim's home in North Yorkshire, England, in March of 2021. Surveillance footage from a supermarket in Harrogate showed Ainsley purchasing the 8-inch blade that he used to kill Woolsey. In the video, he could be seen hiding the knife in his waistband. Upon arriving at the residence, Ainsley repeatedly plunged the blade into Woolsey's body, then dialed 999 and confessed to killing the victim. Before the police arrived, a neighbor discovered Woolsey's remains with the knife sticking out of his chest. An autopsy revealed that he had been stabbed 15 times, including 9 times in the torso and 6 times in the upper arm. Woolsey had also suffered defensive wounds and other injuries to his ribs, shoulder blade, and hands. Ainsley gave multiple conflicting stories about why he killed his friend. He was arrested for murder but denied the charge in court, instead admitting to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility due to his mental health issues and addiction to drugs and alcohol. Prosecutors refused to negotiate a reduced charge and moved forward with a murder case. During Ainsley's trial, a psychiatrist testified that he was not mentally impaired to the point of having a diminished responsibility for his actions, despite his lifelong history of complex mental health issues. On the contrary, the expert witness described the crime as targeted, premeditated, and goal-driven. Ainsley was ultimately found guilty of Woolsey's murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 21 years and 3 months in prison. Number 15. William Harrison Gillespie. In June of 2024, 35-year-old William Harrison Gillespie was booked into the Hernando County Jail in Florida following his arrest for felony battery. A few days later, he was transferred to the jail's medical unit after being injured in a fight with a fellow inmate. 4 days after the fight, Gillespie was called out of his cell to speak with jail staff about the altercation. As he left his cell, he approached a bunk and kicked 49-year-old Yori Lynn Van Antwerp in the head. Security footage showed that the attack was completely unprovoked and that Van Antwerp was attacked while laying in his bed. A corrections officer intervened and Van Antwerp was examined by medical staff. He seemed okay and he acted fine the following day, but his condition deteriorated that evening. A head scan revealed that Van Antwerp was suffering from a brain bleed and he died 36 hours after being kicked by Gillespie. According to Hernando County Sheriff, there was no indication that the two men knew each other or were aware of the nature of each other's charges. All signs point toward Gillespie attacking Van Antwerp for no logical reason, and Gillespie is now facing a second-degree murder charge, which means that his jail stay will likely be much longer than originally planned. Number 14. Anthony Russell. Over a 6-day period in October of 2020, a British heroin addict in his 30s named Anthony Russell killed 3 people in cold blood. His depraved crime spree began with the murder of 32-year-old David Williams at the victim's flat in Coventry, England. 4 days later, Russell murdered David's 58-year-old mother, Julie Williams, at her residence in the same city. The third and final victim was a 31-year-old pregnant woman named Nicole McGregor, who was mercilessly assaulted, killed, and then dumped by a river the day after the murder of Julie Williams. McGregor was lured to her death in a chance encounter when Russell offered to sell her drugs. Just hours after she showed her killer a copy of her sonogram, he attacked her and strangled her with her leggings, not only to silence her at that moment, but to ensure that she would never be able to complain to the police. Her body was found with twigs, leaves, and a piece of wood stuffed in her mouth. In an attempt to cover his tracks, Russell told the father of McGregor's unborn child that he bet he couldn't wait for the upcoming birth, but justice caught up with the heartless killer, and he was soon arrested and taken into police custody. Russell admitted to all 3 murders and was subsequently convicted of assaulting McGregor before he killed her. In a decision that is rarely seen in British courts, the judge imposed a whole life order, which means that he will never again see the light of day outside prison walls unless he successfully appeals his case. Number 13. Rebecca Melon. A twisted saga of domestic violence came to an unceremonious end in July of 2012 when a former stripper named Rebecca Melon dialed 911 and casually confessed to murdering her husband, business owner Donald Melon Jr., in cold blood. The crime was captured on surveillance video at the couple's home in Phoenix, Arizona, where Rebecca fatally shot Donald and then calmly had a cigarette as he took his last breaths. Nobody came to the door when the police arrived, so they forced their way inside, where they found Rebecca sitting on the couch with the gun nearby. She told the responding officers that Donald had entered their bedroom and said some crap, leading to a violent argument. It wasn't the couple's first disagreement that got out of hand, but their home surveillance footage showed that Rebecca shot Donald while he was sitting on the couch, making a phone call, not at a moment of imminent danger. In the video, she could be seen pointing the gun straight at her husband and pulling the trigger after a brief exchange of words. Moreover, experts later testified that Donald might have survived his injuries if he had received medical treatment sooner, but as the security footage showed, Rebecca was in no apparent rush to seek help for her dying spouse. She initially argued in court that she was a victim of domestic abuse, but the video evidence spoke for itself. After realizing the deck was stacked against her, Rebecca pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 18 to 22 years in prison. Number 12. The murder of Jonathan Bacon. In August of 2011, 30-year-old Jonathan Bacon was murdered in broad daylight in a gang shooting outside a hotel in Kelowna, British Columbia. He and 2 of his brothers were members of the Red Scorpions gang, and at least 4 others were targeted in the shooting, but only Bacon died from his injuries. The disturbing act of violence was captured on surveillance video, which showed a Ford Explorer driving up to the hotel's entrance. Inside the vehicle were 3 shooters, 2 of whom rushed out of the Explorer while firing at a white Porsche SUV occupied by Bacon and the other victims. In the footage, Bacon could be seen falling out of the right front passenger door of the Porsche. The driver of the Porsche, a Hells Angel named Larry Amiro, was also struck by one of the bullets, along with backseat passengers Leah Haddon-Watts and Lindsay Black. In the meantime, bystanders ran for cover in order to avoid becoming a casualty of the gang warfare. Once the gunmen accomplished what they came to do, they got back into the Explorer and fled the scene. 2 years after the shooting, authorities charged rival gang members Jason McBride, Michael Jones, and Jujar Koon with first-degree murder and attempted murder. A 4th suspect, Manny Hain, passed away before he could be brought to justice for his actions. All 3 defendants initially pleaded not guilty, but ultimately took plea deals, with McBride receiving a recommended sentence of 18 years to life for second-degree murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. Jones and Koon were given recommended sentences of 18 years each for conspiracy to commit murder with credit for time served, which amounted to roughly a decade behind bars each. Number 11. Lis Gil. In a tragedy that was captured on surveillance video in November of 2013, a 40-year-old autistic man named Andrew Young died after being punched in the face in the British coastal resort town of Bournemouth. The incident began when Young challenged a man outside a Tesco Express store for unlawfully riding his bicycle on the sidewalk. During the disagreement that ensued, the cyclist's friend, 21-year-old Lis Gil, approached and joined the conversation. As the cyclist rode off, Gil, who had previously trained as a boxer, initially appeared to follow before stopping at the last second and turning to punch Young, who fell backwards and sustained a fatal head injury. In early 2014, Gil was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in prison. His term was later lengthened by 6 months after he pleaded guilty to an unrelated charge of handling stolen goods and violating a suspended sentence. Prosecutors attempted to appeal Gil's manslaughter sentence because they didn't think it was long enough, but the original punishment was upheld. Number 10. The murder of Marquette Scott. 32-year-old father of 4, Marquette Scott, was seated in his vehicle at a gas station in Los Angeles in December of 2023 when an unidentified man approached him and shot him dead in cold blood. The crime was captured on surveillance video, which shows the shooter approaching the victim exiting the back seat of a white SUV and approaching the victim in a green jacket and pants. He fired multiple rounds into Scott's head, killing him at the scene. In the meantime, another suspect exited the SUV and fired multiple shots at other individuals who were out of the camera's view. Less than 10 seconds after the first shot was fired, both suspects got back into the SUV and fled the scene. Scott died from his injuries, and authorities did not reveal whether any other targets were injured in the shooting. After exhausting all investigative leads and resources, authorities offered a $50,000 reward in exchange for information leading to the identification and the arrest of the killer. Sadly, the crime remains unsolved to this day. Number 9. Jordan Silva. While helping to film a rap video in Riverview, Florida in 2020, a young woman named Haley Cox was shot dead during a scene involving a staged kidnapping. The scene was supposed to involve a fake gun, but Jordan Silva brought a real gun to the set, and he pulled the trigger while Cox was holding the camera and filming herself in an empty field. She died from her injuries. According to prosecutors, Silva then shot Cox's boyfriend, Eric Branowski, in the chest and leg. Branowski survived his injuries and accused Silva of being the killer. In the meantime, Silva's public defender claimed that the video's director, Giovanni Bosques, was the shooter. A neighbor also supposedly implicated Bosques in the crime, but Silva was charged with murder and attempted murder. Silva rejected a plea deal which would have come with a 40-year prison sentence, and the case went to trial. During the trial, Bosks took the stand and maintained his innocence. He testified that he feared for his life during the shooting, stating, "I just dropped the camera and ran. I knew I was next." In May of 2022, a jury found Silva guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, as well as attempted first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison and is slated for release in the year 2060, at which point he will be 61 years old. Number 8. Joseph Fullwood. On what began as a normal day at work in Brownsville, Florida, in April of 2024, 49-year-old jet ski repair shop owner German Amado de la Cruz Jr. was murdered execution style inside his place of business. The disturbing act of violence was captured on surveillance video, which showed the assailant approaching the victim and gunning him down in cold blood. Thanks to the security footage, police were able to identify the suspected gunman as 46-year-old Joseph Fullwood. He fled the scene on a bicycle. In the meantime, a witness found De La Cruz on the floor of the repair shop with a gunshot wound. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. Fullwood was arrested during a traffic stop a few days later and remains held without bail on suspicion of second-degree murder. He reportedly confessed to the crime after detectives confronted him with the surveillance video, which was inconsistent with the statements he initially provided to the police. His motive has yet to be revealed and the outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 7. Dennis Akpomadei. 21-year-old Anna Judkawayak was walking home from her waitressing job in London one night in May of 2022 when a man in a balaclava ambushed her in an alleyway. The assailant stabbed Judkawayak 40 times and tried to decapitate her as her close friend Jack Maskell looked on in horror. Judkawayak died from her injuries and investigators immediately got to work tracking down her killer. Police identified the attacker as the young woman's ex-boyfriend, 30-year-old Dennis Akpomadei, who was seen trailing after Judkawayak and Maskell on surveillance footage that was captured just before the murder. He had stalked Judkawayak from Newport, Wales and travelled 130 miles to London, where he lay in wait outside the victim's workplace for her to finish her shift. Akpomadei claimed that he had hurt Judkawayak by accident during a sword performance gone wrong. The bizarre excuse failed to convince detectives of his innocence, especially considering Maskell's description of the attack as deliberate. Furthermore, a look into Akpomadei's past revealed that he was obsessed with Judkawayak and had started stalking her after she broke up with him months earlier. In addition to the security video and other evidence pointing toward Akpomadei's guilt, he was connected to the murder through DNA. He was convicted of the crime in 2023, resulting in a life sentence with a minimum of 29 years. Number 6. Matthew Haverly. In March of 2018, the body of a 60-year-old woman was found wrapped in a tarp in Wyalusing Creek near her Bradford County, Pennsylvania home. As police worked to identify her, a reporter questioned 35-year-old local resident Matthew Haverly. He said he had no idea who the deceased woman might be.
I'm like, what the hell's going on? I had no clue.
And speculated that she had fallen victim to organized criminals from out of town.
I think it was kind of a hit and something happened. Something went bad.
Matthew also mentioned how his mother would be concerned to learn about the discovery of a body so close to their home. But as it turned out, the deceased individual was his mother, Patricia Haverly. Police identified the body with help from Matthew's sister, who contacted law enforcement after hearing about an elderly woman's remains being found in the area. Investigators soon learned that Matthew and his mother had a volatile relationship and were known to argue. During questioning, Matthew admitted that he may have pushed Patricia during the disagreement. He claimed that he had no recollection of what happened after that and that Patricia was missing when he woke up the next day. Patricia's cause of death was unclear, but the medical examiner classified it as a homicide based on her injuries, the information Matthew gave during the interview, and the evidence Prosecutors theorized that Matthew had delivered a fatal blow to his mother's head during one of the heated confrontations that they were known to have. In 2019, Matthew pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter in exchange for a 3.5-year to 14-year prison sentence. He later challenged his conviction based on the unclear autopsy findings, but the court ruled that he knew that information before he entered his no contest plea, and the original ruling and sentence were upheld. Number 5. The murder of Mohammed Shah Subani. 27-year-old Mohammed Shah Subani was reported missing by his family in West London in May of 2019. His murdered and partially burned body was found in a shallow, secluded grave in Buckinghamshire several months later. Further investigation revealed that 4 of Subani's friends had killed him during a disagreement over some missing cannabis that they believed he had stolen. One of the murderers, 28-year-old Amraj Punaya, had feigned concern for his missing friend prior to the discovery of Subani's body and had even helped the missing man's family look for him. During that same time period, a second suspect, 23-year-old Mohanad Riyad, obtained false license plate numbers for Subani's vehicle in an attempt to mislead the search effort. One of the clues which helped the prosecution prove the suspect's guilt was a surveillance video which showed Punaya's brother, 26-year-old Ranil Punaya, helping to remove Subani's body from the family-owned business where he was murdered. In 2023, a jury found the Punayas, Riyad, and the 4th defendant, Mahmoud Ismail, guilty for their roles in the disturbing crime. Amraj Punaya was sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years, while Ranil Punaya, Ismail, and Riyad received prison sentences of 7 years, 5.5 years, and 38 months. Number 4. Chan Arslan. For over a decade, Chan Arslan tormented his neighbours in the English village of Walton, Cardiff, with his antisocial behaviour. His long-standing disputes with the community began over trivial matters like disagreements over parking spaces, which spiralled increasingly out of control over time as he refused to let go of his grudges and continued to escalate matters. Arslan had an especially deep hatred for Matthew Borman, who lived nearby with his wife and 3 children. His harassment became so problematic that the Bormans no longer felt safe in their home, prompting them and other nearby residents to seek legal help. They obtained a community protection notice and a council injunction which forbade him from acting violent, but perhaps not surprisingly, it failed to stop Arslan from continuing to go off the rails. In October 2021, while out on bail for a recent harassment charge, 52-year-old Arslan stabbed 43-year-old Borman 27 times in a frenzied knife attack on the victim's front lawn. Borman's wife Sarah saw what was happening and ran outside. She tried pulling Arslan off her husband and was stabbed in the thigh. And while she survived her injuries, Matthew was not so lucky. After stabbing Matthew 27 times, Arslan sat on his body and lit a cigarette. He then proceeded to a nearby residence where a surveillance camera captured footage of him attacking Peter Marsden, who managed to fight off his attacker and survived with 8 stab wounds. In addition to the community's attempts to get help from the authorities in the months leading up to Borman's murder, Arslan told a police officer that he planned to kill his neighbor the day before the crime, and still no action was taken. Sarah Borman later criticized the authorities for their toothless and ineffective responses to Arslan's behavior leading up to her husband's death. At the very least, however, Arslan will probably never get the opportunity to harm an innocent person again. In 2022, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 37 years. Number 3. Chev McGregor. 27-year-old Chev McGregor of Wolverhampton, England, was a devout Pentecostal who believed in heavy-handed discipline when it came to parenting. He thought it was important to toughen children up with implements like a rod and a belt, and he applied these methods to his girlfriend's young son, Jeremiah Regis Ngueja, over a 9-month period in 2016. But McGregor took his strict approach way too far and in November of that year, police were called to the family's home, where they found Jeremiah suffering from blunt force injuries and a bite wound. Jeremiah was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately did not survive, and McGregor was charged with murder. In hindsight, it was clear that McGregor wasn't just an old-school disciplinarian. He had severe anger issues and lacked control over his temper. Just months before Jeremiah's death, McGregor had a meltdown that was captured on home surveillance footage. The video showed him ripping his shirt off, whipping it against the floor, throwing his hands in the air and ripping off a second shirt that he was wearing beneath the first one. McGregor could also be seen pacing aggressively, screaming in a man's face and pushing the individual repeatedly. In a letter he wrote to someone before Jeremiah's death, he wrote, "Cindy Ann does not discipline him, so it must be me. And God gave us pain so we know to do the right thing." McGregor claimed to have no memory of hitting Jeremiah, while the boy's mother, Cindy Ann Regis, initially denied having any knowledge that McGregor was hurting her son. Regis eventually admitted otherwise and was jailed for 40 months. A guilty plea from McGregor followed, and he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years. Today's topic was requested by L.J. Jackson Jr. 6623 and HyperZ 5266. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Restaurant customer turns the tables. Shortly before midnight one evening in January of 2023, 30-year-old Eric Eugene Washington entered the Ranchito No. 4 Taqueria in Houston, Texas, wearing all black clothing, a mask, and gloves. A surveillance camera captured footage of him robbing customers at gunpoint, with some terrified patrons hiding under a table and tossing cash toward Washington, while another diner handed over his wallet. As Washington continued looking for people to rob, the man who had turned over his wallet pulled a handgun and fatally shot the thief. It's evident in the video that he was waiting for the right moment to make his move before he sprang into action. The unnamed civilian retrieved the stolen money from Washington's body and returned it to the victims, then left the scene in a pickup truck. Police identified the man with help from the public. After releasing the security footage, they declined to arrest him after interviewing him and passed the matter on to a grand jury, which decided that the shooting was justified under the state's stand your ground law. No criminal charges were pressed and the man was free to carry on with his life. If you thought those killers getting caught on camera was wild, wait till you see how ordinary 911 calls can turn into complete chaos. After number 1, we've got our previous release of when 911 calls go terribly wrong coming right up. Stay tuned. Number 1. Jal Keen. In September of 2019, 19-year-old Michaela Conley reconnected with former classmate, 21-year-old Jal Keen, who traveled to visit her in Bar Harbor, Maine, after playing football in Europe. After picking Keen up at Boston Logan International Airport, Conley drove to an elementary school playground. Surveillance footage initially showed the two spending time together, only to later capture video of Keen dragging Conley's lifeless body across the same property. He dumped the young woman's remains in a wooded area, where she was later found by a police canine unit. An autopsy found that Conley had died from blunt force injuries and strangulation. Investigators were quick to connect Keen to the crime through the security video and other evidence. During his trial, he claimed he had no memory of killing Conley. Keen was found guilty of Conley's murder in May of 2019. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison and appealed his punishment, but the ruling was upheld by the state Supreme Court. His reasons for killing Conley remain a mystery to this day. Shortly before 5 p.m. on January the 1st of 2019, gunshots were heard from a family home in Melbourne, Florida. As the incident unfolded, Mona Stillwell was on a phone call with 911 emergency services. The woman had recently moved in with her parents after experiencing marital problems. During the 911 call, she was screaming in terror while struggling to tell the operator that her husband was trying to shoot her and her parents. William had shown up to a garden party at the address armed with a 9mm pistol. The operator attempted to find out more details about the situation, but Mona kept screaming at her husband, pleading for him to spare their twin children. The operator could hear the twins crying in the background. At some point during the call, multiple gunshots could be heard, and the operator sent the police to the scene. A neighbor of the Stillwells also called 911 to alert the authorities about the horrific scene that was taking place in the family's backyard. When they arrived at the address, officers found Mona and her parents with gunshot injuries. While the children had escaped the home and had run to a neighbor's home, William was arrested on charges of felony attempted murder, armed burglary, child abuse, and concealing a firearm. He told the police that he'd become enraged upon finding a video on his wife's phone of her and his best friend having intercourse. Mona, her mother, and father were transported to the hospital in stable condition and were treated for their gunshot wounds. Number 7. Adrienne Murray. On May the 20th of 2023, Nichols Murray was at her residence in Indianola, Mississippi, with her 2 children and her nephew when her husband came home at around 4 a.m. The man seemed to be irate when he walked into the house. Nichols consequently directed Adrienne, a son she'd fathered with a different man, to call the police. Adrienne placed a 911 call and officers were sent to the address for what was described as a domestic disturbance. An Indianola Police Department officer reportedly entered the house with his gun drawn and asked those inside to come out. As Adrienne came around the corner of a hallway and into the living room, the man shot him. The victim was left in critical condition and he was taken to the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson, where he was placed on a ventilator and given a chest tube. Adrienne survived the shooting with a collapsed lung, fractured ribs, and a lacerated liver. Following the incident, the officer who shot him was placed on paid administrative leave until June the 15th, when he was suspended by city officials. After the shooting, Adrienne and his mother filed a lawsuit in federal court against the officer, the city of Indianola, its police chief, and 5 other police officers alleging negligence and excessive force. A family lawyer argued that the sheer difference in height meant that Adrienne could not have been confused with the man for whom the police had been called. The family requested $5 million in compensation. Updates indicated that the mayor of Indianola had told the family that the city doesn't have $5 million in the bank and the matter had yet to have been resolved. Number 6. Donna Marie Nichols. 50-year-old Donna Marie Nichols went to a Hardee's fast food restaurant in Rockwood, Tennessee, and bought a hamburger on March the 28th of 2012. Shortly after taking a bite from the sandwich, the woman called 911. She told the operator that her food was no good. According to a transcript of the call, Nichols claimed to have recently been released from the hospital and that she'd worked for 7 hours just to purchase the hamburger, which she described as nasty. She then called the emergency services a second time to complain about her food, and a police officer was dispatched to her location. During her face-to-face interaction with the cop, Nichols revealed that she'd called Hardee's prior to alerting the police and an employee had asked her to come back for a refund. Nichols was arrested for abuse of the 911 system and booked into the county jail with her bail set at $1,500. Number 5. Brandon Cole. On August the 5th of 2023, a Colorado resident called 911 to report a domestic violence incident happening in his Denver neighborhood. Officers were dispatched to 36-year-old Brandon Cole's home, where he lived with his wife and his teenage son. One of Cole's neighbors had told the emergency services operator that the man may have pushed his wife out of a wheelchair and that it was possible he was intoxicated. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the man in the street and his wife lying on the ground next to her wheelchair. The woman asked the police not to pull guns on her husband. Cole reportedly seemed agitated as 2 officers started talking to him and he refused to put his hands up. He was reported to have concealed one of his hands behind his back while holding an unidentified object. Cole then moved towards one of the officers who shot him with a taser that failed to connect, as both of the electrified nodes were required to subdue him. A second officer pointed a gun at him and asked the man to stop. 36-year-old Cole then changed direction and rushed towards her, prompting the officer to fire 2 shots which connected. Cole collapsed and died at the scene, Following the incident, the police officer reported that she thought the man was armed with a knife, but it turned out he'd only been holding a black marker. An investigation was launched to determine if the officer would face criminal charges. Number 4. Tyrie Samson. Missouri teenager Tyrie Samson was visiting Central Florida on a football program trip on March the 24th of 2022 along with a friend and their family. At around 11 p.m., Samson got on the free-fall ride at Orlando's Icon theme park after being refused by the operators of other attractions for being too large to ride safely. He was reported as being 340 pounds on a 6'5" frame at the time. Before the ride had begun, Samson was concerned about the safety harness not being locked in properly. He reportedly told the friend seated next to him, "I don't know, man. If I don't make it down safely, can you please tell my mama and daddy that I love them?" The machine then took the gondola holding Samson and his companions more than 400 feet up in the air before releasing it in a free fall. As the ride reached approximately 100 feet above the ground, the machine braked for about 10 seconds. The teenager slipped out of his harness and fell out of his seat, smashing into the ground in front of horrified park goers. Distraught visitors were reported to have started screaming, and a woman placed a 911 call that would reveal the circumstances surrounding the accident. She told the operator that the seat belt hadn't been properly secured on the teen when the ride started. She also asked for help, claiming that Samson was still breathing as he lay on the ground, but that he wasn't responsive and that his arms and legs appeared to be broken. The woman later informed the operator that no one was able to perform CPR on the teenager because he'd fallen on his stomach and he was too heavy to be shifted onto his back. Samson did not survive the fall and succumbed to his injuries moments later. Following the incident, investigative efforts revealed the teenager's harness had been adjusted to allow a larger gap than normal, and that the weight limit stated in the ride's safety manual was 287 pounds. Samson's family filed a lawsuit in state court against a number of defendants associated with the ride. Updates from the spring of 2023 indicated that the attraction had been torn down and an unspecified settlement had been reached with Samson's family. Number 3. Tianis Jones. On May the 20th of 2022, Tianis Jones drove to a McDonald's in Lakeland, Florida, to pick up an order that she'd previously placed online. The pregnant woman was handed her bag and discovered that the fast food chain employees had made a mistake with her order. She was directed to a different window to have her order redone. 22-year-old Jones became enraged, parked her car, and went inside the restaurant. She grew increasingly displeased. In spite of workers' offers to fix the issue and refund her, Jones went as far as to call 911 to complain that McDonald's had gotten her order wrong. In the moments that followed, she began assaulting the staff, throwing cups and other objects at them before walking behind the counter. Prior to leaving the restaurant, Jones exposed her belly to the staff and began twerking at them. The woman's sister and mother had tried to get her to calm down and remained behind to talk with responding police officers. Following the incident, Jones was arrested on charges of burglary with assault, disorderly conduct, and criminal mischief. Commenting on the incident, Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd would later tell the media that Jones had created a McMess and acted like a McNut, adding that she ended up a McBurglar. Number 2. Saloni Kaur. On February the 13th of 2020, the emergency services in Ohio received a call from 36-year-old Saloni Kaur. The woman complained to the operator that her parents had stopped paying for her cell phone plan. Kaur was informed that her situation was not considered an emergency and asked to refrain from making further contact on the matter. Several hours later, the woman called 911 again, became belligerent, and insisted that her reason for calling was legitimate. She kept making calls to the regional emergency dispatch center, demanding a police response for her issue. Massillon officers were sent to her location, and Kaur was arrested and charged with disrupting public services, considered to be a fourth-degree felony. The woman was taken to jail with her bond set at $2,500. Number 1. Christian Glass. On June the 10th of 2022, Christian Glass called 911 for help after the SUV he was driving broke down in the mountain town of Silva Plume, Colorado, and had become stuck on a dirt road. During his emergency call, the man told the operator that he believed he was being followed. and showed signs of paranoia, hallucinations, and experiencing a mental health crisis. The 22-year-old told the operator, "If I got out of the car, I might be in danger," adding that he loved her being on the line with him while he was frightened. Police officers were sent to his location and approached his SUV asking Glass to step out. The 22-year-old refused to leave his vehicle, saying he was terrified. Officers tried to negotiate for roughly an hour with the young man before they decided to breach the car. After smashing the windows, they peppered Glass with beanbag rounds and tasered him. During the chaos, the 22-year-old reached for a knife and allegedly attempted to stab an officer with it through a broken window. He was then shot 5 times by Clear County Deputy Andrew Buin, with a bullet striking his lungs, liver, and spine. Glass, who was heard repeatedly shouting, "Lord, hear me," during the shooting, died at the scene. Body cam footage would show that he'd never moved from the driver's seat. Police had initially claimed the 22-year-old was the aggressor in the incident, but investigators found he posed no threat and that officers had artificially escalated the situation, resulting in the shooting. Glass's parents sued the force and, in May of 2022, were awarded $19 million, the largest settlement for a police killing in Colorado history. The negotiations had also resulted in the Clear Creek Sheriff's Department being required to establish a crisis intervention team and train the entire force in crisis intervention by the end of 2024. Thanks for watching. Would you allow for your entire lives to be monitored and filmed by a governmental organization if it guaranteed that no foul or harm would ever come to you and your loved ones for the rest of your life? Let us know why in the comments section below.